Hello and welcome. My name is Samuel Abelo, and today I'm going to be talking about the connections between the Hebrew and the Hindus, especially with a focus on Vedanta, which emphasizes the non-dualistic approach. And as far as I know, this was codified by Shankara, who was a Brahmin, and I'm going to talk about the connections that this has with Abraham, the father and prophet of the Hebrews. This is in fact a follow-up video. There were so many wonderful and inspiring comments on my previous video, and I'm going to feature those comments here. But I'm also going to focus particularly on Advaita Vedanta, which is a so-called non-dualistic approach codified by Shankara, who was a Brahmin. And I'm going to talk about that in connection to Abraham, the holy prophet of blessed memory, who is the father of the Hebrews. Just a little bit about me. Today I am a practicing observant Jew, but I actually grew up without the traditions and became very interested in yoga, meaning the physical yoga, and yogaism, the philosophy, Advaita Vedanta, Ayurveda, and so on and so forth. I also studied world myths and cultures through the lens of C.G. Jung, that is, archetypes of the collective unconscious. So even today, the non-dualistic approach, Advaita Vedanta, is something that I can most relate to, but I'm going to do my best to talk about many aspects of Hinduism and Indian culture of which I have a great appreciation. I just want to note that I'm not a scholar. I'm a Hebrew man. I'm also a mystic, an artist, a writer, and a very spiritual person. You know, I look forward to your comments and furthering this discussion, so please subscribe, like, and comment below, and let's engage. Thanks for being with me today, and let's get started. Abraham, Brahmin, what is the connection? Well, let's start here from my perspective. Genesis 25:6 says something very specific. And to the sons of the concubine Hagar, same as Keturah, which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts, and he sent them away from Isaac his son while he was still alive eastward. So Abraham sends the sons of Keturah east. Now, our sages explain that this word concubine has a difficulty in translation. There's just a slight distinction between a wife who has a ketubah, who has a marriage contract, and a wife who does not have a contract. But the inference here is that there's a difference between the sons of Sarah and the sons of Hagar, same as Keturah. Now, what do the sages say about these gifts? The gifts that Abraham gave Isaac, his son through Sarah, were of one kind, and that's the tradition that the Jews have received through many generations. The Sabbath, kosher diet, laws of ritual purity. Now, but it's said that the sons through Keturah that were sent eastward, he gave a different set of gifts. Now, what were those gifts? I think that that's something that we'll have to sort out in our continued research. I understand that many people say the opposite, that Abraham came from Ur, which is close to India, and therefore he took out what was from that region and brought it down and gave it to what became to my people. Now, I want to try and relate to people who have a different tradition. So let's just, see where this leads. Just bear with me. The Hebrews, the Jews, took extensive written documents, and every detail is meticulously gone over. And I know that the Hindus also have very detailed scriptures, but I don't have as much access to your scriptures and whatever is written or whatever is in your oral tradition as much as my own. And from what I understand, is Abraham was not a part of a tradition from India or from another region. His realizations were something that he was surrounded by idol worship, and he came to the realizations of the one, and he spread his knowledge through his sons going forward. And when it says that his sons were sent eastward, it's not that they were sent where he came from. It's that they were sent to a foreign place. He said, you go this way and Isaac will stay here. Now, in terms of dating, the Rig Veda, from my research, is the oldest known Vedic Sanskrit text. From what I can tell, from a basic research, it looks like that is dated to the 2nd millennium BC, which is most likely between 1500 and 1000 BC. This is the Rig Veda Samhita, composed in the northwest region of the Indian subcontinent. I'm going to place here Jay's comment where he disagrees that the Vedas, they are the oldest, written down in 1700 BC, but it probably already existed in 8000 BC. So to the claims that the revelations of the Veda were 8,000 years old, can you provide any evidence to this? And where is that written? And how is that calculated? Because if the claim is that there were other spiritual sages or people contemplating, so-called philosophers, Eastern philosophers living in that region, I have no doubt of that. In our own text, it says that Abraham was surrounded by all sorts of religions, and the religions all contained certain amounts of idol worship, and that he realized something else through his own intellect, and that's what he transmitted to his sons. So the concept that there may have been other religious ideas around him at that time, the second millennium BC, is something that I readily accept. What I do see is that Abraham, if he's sending his sons east, and his name is Abraham, and then sons say, we are of Abraham, we are from Abraham. We're from Abraham. And then they say, oh, I'm a Brahmin priest, and they're in northwest India. And the earliest reference to Brahmin is in the Rig Veda, in a hymn that is called Purusha Sukta. And please excuse my pronunciation, I am just doing whatever best research I can, but in the Purusha Sukta, it begins to mention Brahmin. And I believe this is very famous because it says that, the Brahmins came from the mouth of Purusha in this miraculous way. Now, also mentioned in several comments is Abraham, Brahma, and Sarah, also called Saraswati, Sarah being Abraham's wife. The most wonderful comment I thought was by Sugandhini Srihathas. Sorry if I'm butchering your name, but one of the greatest comments I saw was, I am a Hindu Brahmin background, and I believe we are children of Abraham. If one reads the old Bible or Torah, I find myself in this culture. I grew up like that, keeping all the purity laws and the rituals the same. From Abraham comes Brahma. From Sarah comes Saraswati. From Agar comes Ganja, or Ganji. From Hagar comes Ganja. We are Hindu, comes from the same place, Sindhu. Hindu. There are two rivers. One is called Saraswati and the other one Ganja. The Ganji. It is also a representation of the two wives of Abraham. Even our temple structure is the same as Solomon's temple. These are very profound comments, and I would love to hear follow-ups. Does anyone have more information specifically on the temple structures? And also, what are your ritualistic laws of purity? So we're going to get more to that. What exactly are the wisdoms, the teachings, the ways of conducting oneself that connect from a descendant from Abraham, a Hebrew, a Jew, and the Brahmins who have a priestly order in India? There's a scripture that I came across called the Gautama Dharma Sutra. And in chapter 8, it describes the following. Be always truthful. Teach his art only to virtuous men. Follow rules of ritual purification. Study Vedas with delight. Never hurt any living creature. Be gentle but steadfast. Have self-control. Be kind and liberal towards everyone. Continuing, the Vasitha Dharma Sutra in verse 623 lists discipline, austerity, self-control, liberality, truthfulness, purity, Vedic learning, compassion, erudition, intelligence, and religious faith. Now, the exact sort of the similarities here are almost funny. It's so strong. It's almost like verbatim. You replace Torah study with Vedic study, and you get it's right there. I don't even know what to say. But just as an instance, we have Proverbs 12:10. A righteous man has regard for the life of his beast, meaning that the Hebrew, the Jew, also must very much look after animals. And it's very much written in our scriptures about, that you can't hurt animals just at your will. Proverbs 12:22. Lying speech is an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully please him. So So some of these basics in the Brahmanism, it just couldn't be any more similar. It really couldn't be any more similar. And that's astounding to me. That is a type of similarity, a connection that rings so strongly that there's obviously something there. But we continue. I came across the Bhavishya Purana text. You have a wife Havayavati who will be very eager to see the tree of sin and will go by the shadow of this tree. And there will come a form of a serpent. And then there's also someone in the comments pointed out, and this was a Hare Krishna video, but I looked a little bit more into it. For example, the Satapatha Brahmana talks about a man named Manu. There lived a man in ancient times, a holy man called Manu, who by penances and prayers had won the favor of the Lord in heaven. This is exactly what our scripture says about Noah. And that Manu was said to have 3 sons before the flood, Charma, Sharma, and Yapeti, while Noah also had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And the video that was shared had different translations of the names that were even more similar to the Hebrew descriptions. But what's really important to me as a Hebrew is that when I start looking into the Hindu and the Indian culture, there's so much going on. It's a very large place, many people, and many different variations and traditions. There's the yoga and the yoga philosophy and different groups of yogis, and there's the different millions of different gods. And the most important thing for me to emphasize, and the reason I'm focusing on Advaita Vedanta and non-dualism, is that for the Jew and in terms of Judaism, is that we're not a proselytizing religion. We don't want to convert you. Being Jewish is something that's inherited. It's something that you're born into, and that our purpose in terms of relating to other groups and cultures is to inspire them and to remind them of the one, and not to fall into other aspects. In Advaita Vedanta, I was reminded in my research about the concept of the clay vessel, and that Brahma, the one, is like a clay vessel, and then when there's fragments, or you can use that clay to make idols, but really they only refer to that one. And we take very seriously the misidentification of the divine with its aspects. So I thought that I might explain this just a little bit from the perspective of Jungian psychology. That is, the way of C.G. Jung. You see, mankind tends to project aspects of the unconscious, motifs like from dreams, and put those onto the outer world. This is the basis of exotic myths, which always have an otherworldly nature. This can be called spiritual, but it also has to do with the human capacity to describe mystery, the unknown, and to personify it with forms, that is, images, which demonstrate the edges of understanding. Hence, the deity that represents fecundity, wellness, or the divine consort, which represents the material world, earthly realms, and so on and so forth. But what non-dualism teaches, and what the Jewish mystic is certain of, is that there is an understanding, a perception of reality which is beyond all forms, and yet which contains all forms. I mean this not in terms of physics or geography, but in terms of personifications, images, which demonstrate an aspect of existence, however much spiritual in nature, that is, extending from the edges of mystery. I mean to say that beyond these images is a certain unity, a cohesive center and circumference that contains all opposites, all expressions. It is this absolute which non-dualism emphasizes, and which is hidden in the depths of Jewish mysticism and is known to the Jungian. Spiritual knowledge, a belief that encourages contemplation of this unity, absoluteness itself, introduces a centering dimension to the personality and seems to be connected to potential. It is as if the universe itself, which is full of potential life, is similar to the potential within each of us, which is either thwarted by lifetimes of projective loops stirred by idols which diminish the capacity of the personality to deal with life, to engage with problems, and which further the erroneous ways of a given culture in which one is surrounded. The manifold images which exemplify mere aspects, compartments of potential, aspects of a whole, they take in the individual's attention and lead to labyrinths of misunderstanding and lost opportunity, delusion in a general sense. While perceiving the many as mere parts infers a larger whole, perception of this wholeness extending from a potential absolute encourages the task of including, balancing, and incorporating all of the many, no matter how opposing or attractive one side or one compartment may seem. That so-called monotheism is what's important. And psychologically speaking, being connected to a one center of the personality that is transcendent and all-encompassing. That we should refrain from over-identifying with a single attribute or aspect. In the United States, that could be materialism. It could have been in the past been communism or fascism. But it also could be a certain deity or something like this that causes the personality to become diminished. So that we have something called the Noahide laws, that prior to Abraham there was Noah, and he represented all the nations, as this previous myth that we had looked at. Shem, Ham, and Japheth represent the various nations of the world. And for the Jewish perspective, I'm not asking you to become Jewish, right? That's not the point of this video. But I would encourage you to not worship idols, to never curse the transcendent name, to not commit murder, not to commit adultery, bestiality, or any sort of sexual immorality, not to steal, or to eat the flesh torn from a living animal, and to establish courts of justice. These are what's known as the 7 Noahide laws. They are universal laws, and I understand that your scriptures may have a lot of this already contained in it. I can only emphasize what I know right from my learning, from my background. And so I'm putting forth here that these are the simple, basic tenets that lead to a spiritual life that's balanced and encouraging growth for all peoples. And where you can find it in your culture, I think is good. And I'd like to hear more about that, and where you see some of these Hindu traditions deviating from that, and where it does fall into idol worship. In terms of the books that mention this Aryan invasion, and I understand that's disputed now, I'm going to research more into it. But what I want to focus on today is a little bit about Sanskrit and Hebrew languages. So just in terms of what is available in the scholarly sense or the scientific sense, and I know that if you're religious, you're spiritual, you may say, well, that's just, what they can find or what's available, but this is what our oral tradition says. And I get that. So bear with me. The very earliest text, including the Rig Veda, is generally ascribed to approximately 1500 BC. Again, stemming from the northwestern part of the continent, which again is interesting. Because bear with me, the northwestern edge of the continent, that's where Abraham sent his sons into. So the language is still called in most encyclopedias Indo-European. Now, in terms of the oldest surviving Hebrew text, it's very rare to find old manuscripts. It is recognized in a scholarly sense that Hebrew language as a spoken language in the kingdoms of Israel flourished from 1200 to 586 BC. And this is around the time that the Rig Vedas were being written in Sanskrit. But of course, what do we see in the scriptures is the Tower of Babel, the concept that there was one language, and that when mankind tried to elevate itself and think that it was above God, that the transcendent fragmented all the languages and separated everything, and therefore scattered our thoughts and our understandings. And what are we doing here but trying to regather that? So according to my tradition, the Hebrew language is an original holy language that contains all the other languages in it. And according to what the best knowledge that I have in the subject would be that Sanskrit and Arabic are the closest derivations to the Hebrew language. And bear with me, because I know and I understand that I'm speaking largely to Hindus who believe that Sanskrit is a very holy language, which this doesn't refute, right? If it's very close to what I'm saying is the holy language, Hebrew, and that, but you're also believing that it's very, very ancient and that Hebrew is derived from it. And I understand that. We all have our own perspective and biases that come from where we come from. Talk about this is Jay found similarities between both religions. He asks me, do you believe God can only be called in one name and can only be seen in one form? So my true authentic answer to that is the level of connection that Abraham must have had, our holy prophet and father. Abraham, he must have had such a strong connection that through him eventually came Moses, who had such a pure connection that the sounds that he received are probably the most accurate. That being said, many sounds can elicit the inner subjective experience of the divine. And I believe that it must be that various ethnicities, through the accumulation of experience through the generations, must have a certain preference, and they respond differently to different sounds. For instance, someone in India versus someone in South America, when they hear certain sounds, are going to respond in a different way. But I do ultimately believe that there probably is one sound that is closest, or there are certain expressions that are closest to the divine word itself, and however this design is made, that there is probably an approximation that gets closest and most true. So ultimately, right, like it's almost as if this God, this transcendent, has no name. It is everything. How can you name it? But there are approximate names. And I would say that yes, our scriptures refer probably in the closest way possible, and that the mysteries contained in those names are the deepest and the most profound possible. Now, I've looked at many different cultures in the world, and there are many different ways to refer to attributes and aspects, and to get close to what this is. I know that C.G. Jung looked at the world's mythologies, and he looked at your Atman and the Brahman, and he gave different names. For the Atman, the small self, and for the Brahmin, the large self with a capital S. So however one uses words to refer to what this is a good thing. People to contemplate this, to explore this, and to look for meaning, and to understand the transcendent, and to have a moral responsibility in relation to life and its events and its happenings is all very positive. The second question is, do you believe that your soul is a part of the Supreme Being and will merge with it after you die? When we start to talk about the afterlife, I believe that things get very complicated very quickly. And this is considered mystical knowledge in our tradition and isn't something to just be put out there very easily. But I will say that the Jews, we also speak about reincarnation, and that there is a relationship between the soul and the Supreme Being, if you want to call it this. And this evokes right here, it also evokes for me this concept that in the East there's an emphasis on death and what happens after we die. And I can see where that comes from in the Hebrew scriptures, because we talk about that what you do here is really only a fraction of what will come in the afterlife, and that everything you do here has a consequence for the soul, and that we should be really concerned with what's happening spiritually, which we can't see, and not the mundane world. And so there are these concepts in the East like Maya, illusion, and samsara, the wheels of reincarnation, and the material world is an illusion. And this makes sense. But where I think that becomes sometimes an issue philosophically to me is when the intellectually that becomes a way to renounce the world and to go towards aestheticism, the path of the aesthetic and asceticism in general, that renounces this life in order to ultimately achieve a certain nirvana or state of complete equanimity, and therefore re-merge with the Supreme, to merge again with the Supreme Being. That in terms of what happens to the soul after we die, I would emphasize that in my tradition, it matters what we do here, and we have a responsibility to act and to be good, moral, and creative. That means to contribute to the world in a positive way. People. It says here, do you believe there are multiple ways to gain the ultimate goal, or that there is only one way? Like I mentioned before, the path of Judaism is not for every group in the world, although there are things to learn from us, and that's why I'm having these conversations. But there are definitely wrong ways, and that always includes idol worship. What that really means is not identifying with an ism like materialism or fascism, making politics your religion, or music or something like this, or a person, especially a person like a guru or a Jesus or something like this, into God. And definitely not worshiping and believing that statues are little figurines are God. There's an assumption here about the ultimate goal, and I just addressed this before, that the ultimate goal that I see may be slightly different than the ultimate goal that you're looking for. I don't know. Tell me, what is the ultimate goal to you? Because the ultimate goal to me is to live a life that contributes in a positive, creative, and is effective in community and towards all of humanity in the world in this life. It's not to renounce this life and to merge again with the Supreme Being, because this world is illusion, right? We see that God is everything, it's non-dualistic, it's in everything, and that this world matters. My initial research into Santana Dharma is that it again, like in Hinduism, there's so much going on. I'm trying to wrap my, there's a lot. So I'm looking here, and it's like there were, these various denominations or paths, and they were subsumed under this Sanatani identity or term. And that includes Shaivism, like worship of Shiva, or the path of Shiva, and Shaktiism. I'm going to talk about what I'm more familiar with, and maybe we can follow up more on Santanism and Santani Hinduism another time. I'm just going to talk about what I'm more familiar with, especially in terms of the Sadhu, and because I see some connections there to the Hebrew. And this is similar to, in my previous video on the Rastafarians, that there is this concept of the Nazir who grows out his hair, in sort of like dreadlocks, and, wildly grows out his hair, and becomes very holy and takes on a path of holiness and abstinence from alcohol. This path of like sort of renunciation, I think it's amplified very much in Sadhu culture. And there's this aspect of mourning, like he leaves his family, right? The Sadhu leaves his family and renounces his name. And in the Hebrew tradition, we have this thing where when one is mourning, it's mentioned in the scriptures in various places that he covers himself in ashes and wears sackcloth. And that reminds me of the Sadhu, because what is he doing? He covers himself in ashes, and it's like he's mourning life, like the Maya, the illusion, and he's just trying to destroy his ego, right? To annihilate his ego, so to speak, and lives this path of renunciation, and he's covered in ashes, right? And he wears like a little loincloth or what have you. And by renouncing the world's pleasures and by becoming abstinent, he is able to transform his sexual energy very much. That this transformation of sexual energy and retention of the male seed is something that's emphasized in our tradition, although very much concealed, and isn't something that it's very esoteric. I can't just tell you on camera here. But the fact that it's so strong in the yogi and the sadhu culture is something that I think that is more than just archetypal, in the sense that various people in other places can all discover the same theme, that there is this ability to transform energy. It seems more like certain traditions or certain wisdom knowledges got passed around. especially in the sense that much later on, it's known that the Arabs had retained these manuscripts and brought them into Europe when they conquered, Spain, southern Europe, and brought in what became alchemy. And the Jews who were living there also combined their mysticism with alchemy. And in alchemy, what is talked about there, especially when we look at interpretations by C.G. Jung and his work on alchemy, is the transformation of sexual energy, and that sexual energy is very much related to the divine. So not only are there connections that we've looked at between who Abraham was and what traditions he had and what he passed on to his sons and what may have been brought into northern India through the Brahmins, and the connections between the Hebrew and what's in our scriptures and your scriptures, but there also are Jews in India, meaning that there are Jews who are actually from our tradition and have also parts of your culture involved. So with that, I just want to thank you for listening. Again, my name is Samuel Abelo. Please subscribe, like, and comment below. Let's continue to have a conversation and to engage with one another. I'd like to continue this series to learn more about one another, to really have a conversation.